Tonight, we travel back 3,000 years. Back to a world where the mountains had names and the sea had a face, where thunder was the voice of a god and the turning of seasons was the grief of a mother, where heroes sailed toward the edge of the known world and the dead waited quietly on the far shore of a dark river. These are the old stories, the ones that were told before writing, passed from mouth to ear around fires that have long since gone cold. The Greeks who first told them were not so different from us. They were afraid of the dark and astonished by beauty and baffled by why the world was the way it was. And so they made stories, stories to explain the stars and the sea and the strange and painful fact of being human. Tonight we'll move through 100 of them, slowly, beginning with the very first, the birth of the world from nothing, and ending somewhere much quieter. You don't need to follow every thread. You don't need to stay awake for all of it. These stories have been told for 3,000 years. They will still be here whenever you return. Before we begin, a word. This channel is new. MindFall started because some of us, maybe many of us, have minds that won't go quiet when the lights go out. That needs something real and beautiful to hold onto as sleep arrives. The plan is simple: mythology, psychology, science, history. Real things told slowly, designed for the dark. If tonight's journey through these ancient stories helps you drift away, a subscribe or a like would mean the world. It helps the channel find other restless minds out there in the dark. Now make yourself comfortable, let your body settle, let the day go. The ancient Greeks believed that sleep was a god. His name was Hypnos, and he lived in a cave at the edge of the world, where poppies grew and a river of forgetfulness ran past his door. Every night, he rose into the sky and touched the eyes of the weary. Consider this his invitation. Let's begin. Story number 1, the world before the world. In the beginning there was nothing, or rather there was something, but it had no shape, no edge, no up or down. The Greeks called it chaos. Not chaos as we mean it, not disorder or noise, but the original void. A vast, dark, undivided opening. Out of this opening, the first things emerged. Not born, not made, simply present. Gaia, the deep earth. Tartarus, the abyss below everything. Eros, the force of desire that would draw all things toward each other. And Erebus, the darkness that lives where light has never reached. This was the beginning. Not with a roar, but with a slow opening like an eye. Story number 2, Gaia and the sky. Gaia, the earth, was the first true mother. She did not wait to be loved. She simply produced children without a partner, out of her own deep will. First she made Uranus, the sky, who arched himself over her like a dome. He was vast and blue and covered her entirely, and she loved him, and they made children together, the Titans, vast beyond imagining, the first gods of power and time. But Uranus was afraid of his children. He pushed them back into Gaia before they could be born, keeping them trapped inside the earth. And the earth groaned. Story number 3, the fall of Uranus. Gaia was in pain, and she was patient, and she was dangerous. She shaped a blade from grey flint and went to her imprisoned sons. Only one answered her, Cronus, the youngest Titan, the most cunning. He took the blade, he waited, and when Uranus descended to lie upon the earth as night fell, Cronus struck. Uranus was overthrown. His blood fell into the sea, and from that blood Aphrodite was born, the goddess of love, rising from the foam. From his fall came beauty. That is how the Greeks saw it. Even violence, even ruin, could produce something that the world had not imagined yet. Story number 4, Cronus and the Swallowing. Cronus became the king of heaven. He married his sister Rhea. They had children: Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, 6 in all. But a prophecy haunted him, a prophecy that said his own child would overthrow him, just as he had overthrown his father. And so Cronus swallowed each child as it was born, whole. Rhea watched him swallow them one by one, and she said nothing until the 6th. Story number 5, the birth of Zeus. When the 6th child was coming, Rhea wrapped a stone in swaddling clothes and gave it to Cronus. He swallowed it without looking. The real child, a boy, was carried secretly to the island of Crete. He was hidden in a cave on Mount Ida, nursed by a goat named Amalthea, raised by nymphs who clashed bronze shields outside the cave whenever he cried so his father would not hear. They called him Zeus. He grew up alone at the edge of the world, and when he was grown, he came home. Story number 6, Zeus and the War of the Titans. Zeus returned to his father's house disguised as a cupbearer. He gave Cronus a drink laced with something to make him retch, and Cronus brought up the 5 swallowed children, first the stone, then Poseidon, Hades, Hera, Demeter, Hestia, all full-grown, all furious, all finally free. What followed was a war that lasted 10 years. The Titans on one side, Zeus and his siblings on the other, joined eventually by the Cyclopes and hundred-handed giants Cronus had imprisoned. Thunder rolled across the sky. The sea churned. The earth split. In the end, the Titans fell. Cronus was exiled to the edge of the world, and the new gods took their places. Story number 7, the division of the world. With the Titans defeated, 3 brothers divided the world between them. Zeus drew the sky, Poseidon drew the sea, Hades drew the underworld, the realm of the dead, beneath the roots of everything. The earth itself was not drawn. The earth belonged to all of them and none of them. The gods could walk on it. Humans would live on it. It was common ground. Zeus became king, not because he was oldest, he was the youngest, but because he had won. And in the age of the Greeks, that was reason enough. Story number 8, the making of human beings. The gods had the world, but the world was quiet without creatures in it. 2 brothers were given the task of populating the earth: Prometheus, whose name means foresight, and Epimetheus, whose name means hindsight. Together, they fashioned creatures from clay. Epimetheus gave out gifts: claws to the lion, speed to the deer, shells to the turtle, feathers to the birds. He was generous, and by the time he reached humans, he had nothing left. Prometheus looked at the naked, fragile creatures and took pity. He gave them something no other animal had. He gave them fire. Story number 9, Prometheus and the theft of fire. Fire was not his to give. Fire belonged to the gods, specifically to the forge of Hephaestus on Mount Olympus, and Zeus had decided that humans should not have it. Prometheus climbed to Olympus and held a hollow reed to the flame. He carried it back down to earth, hidden inside the stalk, a small ember glowing in the dark. He gave it to the humans he had shaped. They built fires. They cooked meat. They gathered in the dark and told each other stories by the light. Zeus saw the fires burning across the earth, and his anger was cold and slow and complete. Story number 10. The punishment of Prometheus. Zeus chained Prometheus to a cliff at the edge of the world, a cliff in the Caucasus Mountains, somewhere east of everything known. Every day an eagle came and ate his liver. Every night the liver grew back. The next morning the eagle returned. This was not for a day or a year. The Greeks said it lasted thousands of years, until Heracles came and broke the chains and killed the eagle and set the firebringer free. Prometheus never apologized. He had seen the future, and he believed what he had done was right. Whether Zeus forgave him, the myths do not say clearly. Story number 11. Pandora. Zeus was not finished. He had punished the giver of fire. Now he would punish the receivers. He ordered Hephaestus to create a woman from clay. The gods gave her gifts: beauty from Aphrodite, curiosity from Hermes, skill from Athene. They called her Pandora, all gifted. Then they gave her a jar. She was sent to Earth as a gift to Epimetheus, who accepted her despite Prometheus's warning never to accept gifts from Zeus. In his house sat the jar sealed. She had been told not to open it. She opened it. Out came everything the jar had held: sickness, sorrow, envy, hunger, grief. Everything that plagues a human life poured into the world. Pandora slammed the lid down. One thing remained inside: hope. Whether that was a mercy or the cruelest thing of all, the Greeks left unanswered. Story number 12. The Great Flood. The world grew corrupt. Humans became so violent, so faithless, so far from what they had been made to be, that Zeus decided to end them. He sent a flood. The rain fell for 9 days and 9 nights. The rivers rose, the plains became sea, the mountains became islands, and then the islands sank. One man had been warned, Deucalion, the son of Prometheus, who had listened to his father's counsel. He built a chest, sealed it, and climbed inside with his wife Pyrrha. For 9 days they floated. When the rain stopped, the chest came to rest on Mount Parnassus. They emerged onto a world of silence and mud. They asked the oracle how to restore humanity. The oracle told them to throw the bones of their mother over their shoulders. They understood. Gaia was the mother of all. Her bones were stones. They threw stones behind them, and the stones became people. Story number 13. The 5 Ages. The Greeks believed the world had been through 5 ages, each worse than the last. First, the Golden Age, a time before Zeus, when humans and gods lived together. The earth gave everything freely, and no one grew old. Then the Silver Age, shorter, harder, the first winters and the first need to plant. Then the Bronze Age, men of bronze, fierce and proud, who destroyed each other with their own strength. Then the Heroic Age, the age of the great heroes, of Troy and the Argonauts. And finally the Iron Age, the age the Greeks believed they were living in. Heavy work, injustice, war, grief. And yet, because it was the age of heroes, not quite forgotten, still lit, occasionally, by something worth remembering. Story number 14. Mount Olympus. Olympus was not quite a place, and not quite an idea. It was the highest mountain in Greece. That much was real, its peak lost in cloud. But the Olympus of the gods was above the clouds, in a realm of perpetual light, where the sky was always clear and the air tasted of something that was not quite air. The gods feasted there on ambrosia and nectar. They argued and loved and schemed. Their emotions were enormous. Their jealousy could start wars. Their grief could change the seasons. They were immortal, but they were not serene. They were passionate in the way that only things that cannot die sometimes are. Story number 15. Hestia, the Forgotten Goddess. Not all of the 12 Olympians were celebrated equally. Hestia was perhaps the quietest. She was the goddess of the hearth, the fire at the center of the house, the warmth that made shelter real. She had been swallowed first by Cronus and released last, and perhaps that long dark time inside had made her love stillness. She asked Zeus for nothing. She never married, never went to war, never appeared in most of the great myths. She simply kept the fire burning at the center of Olympus, as she kept a fire burning in every home in Greece. There is a kind of power in that, not the power of thunder or conquest, the power of being the thing that everything else depends on. From the earliest beginnings of the world, we move now to the gods who shaped it, the 12 Olympians, each carrying their own domains, their own desires, their own long and complicated stories. They were not kind gods necessarily. They were powerful and proud and sometimes generous. They were in many ways deeply human. Story number 16. Zeus, King and Wanderer. Zeus was king of the gods, holder of the thunderbolt, lord of the sky and the law. He was also, by every account, ungovernable in his own appetites. He loved widely and constantly. He transformed himself into a swan, a bull, a shower of gold, an ordinary man, to pursue the mortals and goddesses who caught his attention. His wife Hera knew of almost all of it, and her jealousy was legendary and precise, directed rarely at her husband and almost always at the women he pursued. Zeus was justice and Zeus was chaos. The Greeks did not resolve this contradiction. Perhaps they thought it unnecessary. He was king because he was the strongest, and the strongest did what they wished. Story number 17. Hera's long memory. Hera was not simply the jealous wife. She was the goddess of marriage and of women, and she took both seriously. She was older than Zeus. She had been swallowed before him, and she had married him knowing what he was. Some versions say she was tricked. Some say she chose. Either way, she stayed. Her revenge was patient. She hounded the women Zeus loved. She sent monsters after heroes who were his illegitimate children. She made Heracles, the greatest hero who ever lived, suffer from the moment he was born, not because she was cruel, because she had been wronged and she did not forget. She and Zeus quarreled constantly, and the marriage held anyway, the way things hold when they are woven into the structure of the world. Story number 18. Poseidon and the Sea. Poseidon was Zeus's brother and sometimes his rival. He was the god of the sea, of earthquakes, of horses. When he was angry, and he was often angry, he struck the earth with his trident, and the sea rose, or the ground shook, or a new spring burst from dry rock. He loved the sea with the possessiveness of a man who built the thing himself. He had a palace beneath the waves, where sea creatures pulled his chariot and sea nymphs attended him, and the pressure of the deep water pressed against its walls. He once competed with Athene for the city of Athens. He struck a rock, and a saltwater spring leapt up. She planted an olive tree. The Athenians chose the olive. Poseidon did not forgive them quickly. Story number 19, Hades and the Underworld. Hades drew the shortest lot and received the realm no one wanted. He was not evil. The Greeks were careful about this. He was stern, implacable, just. He did not invite the dead, they simply arrived. He did not rejoice in death, he governed what was already inevitable. His realm had different regions, the fields of asphodel for ordinary souls, neither rewarded nor punished. Tartarus for the condemned, the deepest pit, where the Titans were imprisoned and where certain sinners endured punishments designed to last forever. Elysium for the blessed, a meadow where the heroic dead walked in permanent evening light. He had a helmet that made him invisible. He rarely left his kingdom, and when he did, it was always for something that changed everything. Story number 20, Apollo, god of light. Apollo was one of the most beloved gods in Greece and one of the most complex. He was the god of the sun, of music, of poetry, of prophecy, of healing. He drove the chariot of the sun across the sky each day. He played the lyre with a perfection that made the rivers stop to listen. He was also the god of plague. When he was angered, when his priests were dishonored, when his gifts were refused, he sent arrows of disease from his silver bow, invisible as rays of light. He loved badly and often. Daphne fled from him and became a laurel tree. Hyacinthus died in his arms. Cassandra accepted his gift of prophecy and refused him, and he cursed her so that no one would believe her truths. He was beautiful and terrible and could not understand why being both was not enough. Story number 21, Artemis the Untamed. Artemis was Apollo's twin, born just before him on the island of Delos, and she helped her mother through the long labor of his birth. She was, from her first moments, a helper, a guardian, a presence of strength. She asked her father Zeus for a bow and arrows, hunting dogs, a short tunic, a wild mountain for her domain, and the gift of eternal virginity. He gave her all of it. She roamed the forests with her band of nymphs. She protected young girls and women. She was the goddess of the moon, and she was merciless to any man who violated the sanctuary of her forests or threatened her companions. There was a kind of freedom in her that the Greeks seemed to need to imagine, even if they did not always understand it. Story number 22, Athene born from the mind of Zeus. Zeus had swallowed his first wife Metis because a prophecy said her children would surpass their father. But a child was already growing, and in time Zeus's head began to ache so terribly that Hephaestus had to split it open with an axe. Out came Athene, fully grown, fully armored, crying out a war cry that shook the sky. She was the goddess of wisdom and of warfare, but specifically the warfare of strategy, not of brute force. She was her father's favorite. She carried his thunderbolt. She presided over the crafts, over skill, over the careful, patient work of the mind. No one had a mother in the traditional sense among the gods, and Athene had one less than most. Story number 23, Ares and the love of war. Ares was the god of war, and he was one of the few Olympians that even other gods seemed to dislike. He was brutal where Athene was strategic. He loved bloodshed for its own sake. He was enormous and loud, and in battle he cried out with the voice of 10,000 men. The Greeks were honest about what he represented. They did not pretend that war was noble. Ares was powerful, necessary, and not particularly wise. He loved Aphrodite. She loved him back in her complicated way. Together they had children, Eros among them, the god of love, the child of war and beauty. The Greeks saw no contradiction in this. Story number 24. Aphrodite rising from the sea. She was born from the foam of the sea where Uranus's blood had fallen, or she was the daughter of Zeus and a sea nymph named Dione, depending on which version you were told. Either way, she was beautiful beyond description. When she walked onto shore, flowers grew under her feet. The sea nymphs dressed her. The three graces attended her. She was the goddess of love and beauty, and she was not gentle about it. Love in the Greek world was not always kind. It was a power, and Aphrodite wielded it without apology. She could make anyone desire anyone. She could take away desire just as suddenly. She married Hephaestus. She loved Ares. She arranged the destiny of Troy. She is perhaps the most powerful god in all the myths, for the simple reason that she governed the one force even Zeus could not resist. Story number 25. Hephaestus and the Fire of Craft. Hephaestus was the smith of the gods, the maker, the builder. He worked in a forge beneath a volcano, and the hammering you sometimes heard in the earth was him at his anvil. He was lame. He had either been born that way or been thrown from Olympus. One story says Hera threw him because she was ashamed of his ugliness. Another says Zeus threw him during an argument. Another says the fall caused the lameness. The myths disagreed, as they often did, about who was to blame. What was certain was what his hands could make: armor for Achilles, a golden net to catch his unfaithful wife Aphrodite and her lover Ares, automatons of gold and silver that walked and thought and assisted him, palaces for the gods, the chains of Prometheus. The most wounded god made the most beautiful things. Story number 26. Hermes' first day of life. Hermes was born at dawn and had completed a significant portion of his legendary career before nightfall. He climbed from his cradle, walked out of the cave where he was born, and almost immediately encountered a tortoise. He killed it, strung its shell with gut strings, and invented the lyre. That afternoon, he wandered to Thessaly and stole 50 of Apollo's cattle, leading them backward so their hoofprints pointed the wrong way, then hiding them in a cave. He slaughtered 2 and created fire by rubbing sticks together, inventing the fire drill in the process. By evening, he was back in his cradle, wrapped in his blankets, pretending to be asleep when Apollo arrived, furious. Zeus laughed at the whole business and made them brothers. Hermes gave Apollo the lyre. Apollo, somewhat appeased, gave Hermes the cattle. They were friends forever after. Story number 27. Demeter and the First Winter. Demeter was the goddess of grain and harvest, of the turning of the seasons, of all that grew from the earth. She was the reason fields turned green in spring and gold in autumn. She had a daughter, Persephone, and she loved her with everything in her. One day Persephone was in a meadow gathering flowers. The earth cracked open. A chariot drawn by black horses came up out of the dark. Hades reached out and took her. Demeter searched for her daughter for 9 days and 9 nights, asking every creature she met if they had seen anything. On the 10th day, Helios, the sun god, told her the truth. Demeter's grief became the world's grief. She stopped the crops from growing, the earth went cold, the livestock died, people began to starve. The gods had to intervene. Story number 28, Persephone and the Pomegranate. Zeus sent Hermes down to the underworld to negotiate. Hades, who was genuine in his strange way, had made Persephone queen, but she could return to her mother. On one condition: she had not eaten anything in the underworld. The rule was that those who ate the food of the dead could not live. She had been careful. But just before Hermes arrived, just before she was to go, she ate 6 seeds of a pomegranate. Some say Hades tricked her, some say she chose. The myths leave this ambiguous. The result: she would spend 6 months of the year in the underworld and 6 months above. When she descended, Demeter grieved and the world went cold. When she returned, the grain grew, the flowers opened, and spring arrived. Every year since then, the world has grieved with Demeter, and every year she comes back. Story number 29, Dionysus and the Vine. Dionysus was a later Olympian. There was a version of the myth in which he replaced Hestia on the council. He was the god of wine, of ecstasy, of the theater, of everything that loosened the ordinary grip of things. He was twice born. His mother was a mortal woman named Semele, who was tricked by Hera into asking Zeus to appear to her in his true divine form. No mortal could survive that sight. Semele burned, but Zeus rescued the unborn child from the fire and sewed him into his own thigh until he was ready. He grew up differently from most gods, disguised as a girl, raised in remote places, hunted by Hera who never quite forgot. He wandered. He found the grapevine. He made wine. He brought his gift to the world. Those who welcomed him were joyful. Those who refused him suffered. Joy, he seemed to say, is not optional. It arrives on its own terms. Story number 30, Apollo and the Oracle at Delphi. Before Apollo claimed Delphi, the site was sacred to something older. A great serpent, the Python, lived in the caves beneath Mount Parnassus and breathed the fumes of the earth. It was ancient and vast, and had been there since Gaia first placed it as guardian. Apollo came and killed it with his silver arrows. He claimed the site. He built his temple. He installed his priestess, the Pythia, who sat above the fumes on a 3-legged stool and spoke in riddles that required translation. Kings and generals and ordinary people came from across the Greek world to ask the oracle their most important questions. The answers were always true. They were rarely clear, and the Greeks noticed, over time, that the oracle had never actually been wrong, only misunderstood, always a little too late. From the gods, we turn now to the heroes who walked among them, mortal men and women who did things that the world still remembers. They were not gods, but they were more than ordinary. They were the Greeks' way of imagining what a human being, at the extreme edge of what is possible, might become. Story number 31, Perseus and the Dangerous Beginning. Perseus was born because a prophecy made his grandfather afraid. King Acrisius of Argos was told that his daughter Danae's son would one day kill him. So he locked Danae in a tower of bronze. No doors, no windows, just walls. Zeus found her anyway, coming to her as a shower of golden light, Perseus was born. Acrisius put mother and son in a wooden chest and dropped them in the sea. The sea carried them to a small island called Seriphos, where a kind fisherman named Dictys found them on the beach. Perseus grew up on that island, strong and quick, and already marked by something brighter than ordinary fate. Story number 32, Perseus and Medusa. The king of Seriphos wanted Danae, and Perseus stood in the way. So the king sent him on an impossible errand: bring back the head of Medusa. Medusa was one of the three Gorgons, creatures so terrible that looking at them directly turned a man to stone. Her hair was serpents, her gaze was death. The gods helped. Hermes gave Perseus a sword. Athene gave him a polished shield to use as a mirror. He found the Gorgons asleep. He watched only the reflection. He cut off Medusa's head, eyes closed, sealed it in a bag, and ran. From the blood of her neck sprang two things: Chrysaor, a golden giant, and Pegasus, the winged horse. Even in her death she made things. Story number 33, Perseus and Andromeda. On his way home, Perseus flew over Ethiopia and saw something strange at the shore. A young woman was chained to a rock above the sea. Her name was Andromeda. Her mother, the queen, had boasted of being more beautiful than the sea nymphs, and Poseidon had sent a sea monster to punish the country. The king had been told by an oracle that the monster would only be appeased by the sacrifice of his daughter. Perseus landed. He negotiated. He killed the monster with his sword or with Medusa's gaze. The stories differ. He freed Andromeda. He married her and brought her home. And later, when he came home to Argos and his grandfather accidentally fell in the path of a discus Perseus threw at athletic games, the prophecy completed itself as quietly as prophecies always did. Story number 34, Heracles, the birth and the curse. Heracles was the greatest hero the Greeks ever imagined. He was also the most tormented. His mother was Alcmene, a mortal woman. Zeus, disguised as her husband, came to her, and Heracles was conceived. When Hera found out, she was furious. She sent 2 serpents into the infant's crib. Heracles was perhaps 8 months old. He strangled both serpents before anyone could reach him. He grew up larger than other men, stronger than seemed possible. He could kill a lion with his hands. He was kind when he was calm. But Hera never stopped. When Heracles was an adult, with a wife and children he loved, she sent madness down upon him. In that madness, he killed them. When the madness cleared, he understood what he had done. He went to Delphi to ask how he could ever atone. Story number 35, The 12 Labors. The oracle at Delphi sent Heracles to serve his cousin Eurystheus, king of Tiryns, for 12 years. Whatever the king commanded, Heracles must do. Eurystheus was small and nervous and deeply uncomfortable with the existence of anyone larger than himself. He gave Heracles the hardest tasks he could imagine. Kill the Nemean lion, whose skin no blade could pierce. Destroy the Hydra, whose heads grew back doubled when cut. Clean the Augean stables in a single day, a task too large for ordinary work. Capture the Cernician hind, sacred to Artemis. Steal the apples of the Hesperides, golden fruit at the edge of the world, guarded by a dragon. And more after that, 12 in total, each one impossible, each one done. The Greeks told this story, perhaps, because they needed to believe that even the most crushing guilt could be worked off. That 12 years of impossible effort might be enough to earn the right to live again. Story number 36, Heracles and the Nemean Lion. The first labor was the simplest and the most important. The lion lived near Nemea and had been terrorizing the region for years. Its skin was impervious to weapons, arrows bounced off it, spears splintered. No sword could cut it. Heracles tried anyway, and the weapons failed, and he understood. He dropped his bow. He entered the lion's cave where it slept. He wrestled it with his bare hands. He strangled it. He tried to skin it with his knife and could not. Eventually, he used one of the lion's own claws. He wore the skin as armor for the rest of his life, the impenetrable protection of the thing he had overcome. He emerged from the cave changed, already, into something larger than himself. Story number 37, Heracles and the Hydra. The Hydra lived in a swamp near Lerna, a water serpent with 9 heads, and the central head was immortal. Every time a head was cut off, 2 grew back in its place. Heracles went into the swamp with his nephew Iolaus. He cut heads, they multiplied. He cut more. He was sinking into the swamp, surrounded by regenerating serpents, and something had to change. Iolaus had brought a torch. As Heracles cut, Iolaus burned the stump, each neck seared before the new heads could form. They worked together through the dark of the swamp until only the immortal central head remained. Heracles cut it off, and since it could not die, he buried it under a great rock. He dipped his arrows in the Hydra's poisonous blood. Those arrows would appear again, years later, in ways he could not have anticipated. Story number 38, the Augean Stables. King Augeas kept the largest herds of cattle in all of Greece. He had never cleaned his stables. In 30 years, an enormous accumulation had built up, a task that would require thousands of men and many months to address. Eurystheus gave Heracles one day. Heracles looked at the stables. He looked at the 2 rivers that ran past them, the Alpheus and the Peneus. He diverted both rivers. The water rushed through the stables with a force that took everything with it. In a day, the rivers had done what Eurystheus believed could not be done. Eurystheus refused to count the labor because Heracles had been clever rather than simply strong. But Heracles had done it, and the rivers still run there, past what remains of the valley, carrying nothing now but water and time. Story number 39, the descent to the underworld. The 12th and final labor was the one Eurystheus had designed to be truly impossible. Go to the underworld, bring back Cerberus, the 3-headed dog who guarded the entrance to the realm of the dead without weapons. Heracles descended. The dead parted before him. He walked the asphodel fields. He spoke to the shade of Medusa's sister who had been made mortal. He found Hades himself. He asked Hades, just and implacable, but with a sense of the appropriate, gave permission on one condition: no weapons, strength alone. Heracles wrestled Cerberus with his bare hands, 3 heads snapping, and he did not let go. Eventually, the dog went still. He carried him up to the light. He showed him to Eurystheus, who was so terrified he climbed into a storage jar and refused to come out. Then Heracles brought Cerberus back to where he belonged. The labors were done. Story number 40, Theseus and the Minotaur. Athens paid a tribute to Crete. Every 9 years, 7 young men and 7 young women were sent to the labyrinth at Knossos. The labyrinth was the home of the Minotaur, a creature with the body of a man and the head of a bull, and it ate the tribute. Theseus, Prince of Athens, chose to go himself. The king of Crete's daughter Ariadne saw Theseus and fell in love with him. She gave him a ball of thread. He tied one end at the entrance of the labyrinth and carried the ball in with him, unspooling it as he went. He found the Minotaur in the dark center of the maze and killed it. Then he followed the thread back out through the dark corridors and emerged into the light of Crete, with the surviving Athenians behind him. Story number 41, Theseus and the Black Sails. Theseus and Ariadne sailed away from Crete together. He abandoned her on the island of Naxos while she slept. The myths give various reasons, all of them insufficient. She woke to find the ships gone. She was found there by Dionysus, who loved her, and she became his wife and his queen. Perhaps that was a better fate. Theseus sailed home in grief or in guilt. He had promised his father Aegeus that if he survived, he would change the ship's black sails, sails of mourning, to white ones. He forgot. Aegeus was watching from the cliffs. He saw the black sails. He threw himself into the sea that still bears his name, the Aegean. Theseus arrived home to a kingdom that was now his, to an empty shore, to the particular grief of a man who has survived everything except the cost of his own forgetting. Story number 42, Jason and the Golden Fleece. Jason came to claim his birthright, a throne that had been stolen from his father. The king who held it gave him a condition: bring back the Golden Fleece, the magical skin of a golden ram that hung in the sacred grove of Colchis at the far end of the known world. It was guarded by a dragon that never slept. Jason built the greatest ship that had yet been built, the Argo. He gathered the finest heroes in Greece to sail with him. They called themselves the Argonauts. They sailed through clashing rocks that ground ships to splinters. They fought harpies and Amazons and men who grew from dragons' teeth. They arrived finally at Colchis, where the fleece hung in the dark grove and the dragon coiled at its roots. Story number 43, Medea. Medea was the king of Colchis's daughter. She was also a sorceress of terrifying skill, and when she saw Jason, she fell in love with him, or the gods directed her to. In this story and others, it was sometimes difficult to tell the difference. She helped him. She gave him ointments to make him impervious to fire. She put the dragon to sleep with her herbs. She took the fleece herself and brought it to him. She left her home and her family and her country to sail away with him. Together they outran the Colchian fleet. Together they returned to Greece. Together, for a time, they prospered. And then Jason chose to make a political marriage and set Medea aside. What followed is one of the darkest stories in all of Greek mythology, and we will leave it at that edge, at the threshold, where love and fury become the same thing, and the consequences lasted beyond anything Jason had imagined. Story number 44, Bellerophon and Pegasus. When Perseus cut off Medusa's head, Pegasus, the winged horse, sprang from the blood and flew free. For a long time no one rode him. Bellerophon was a young man from Corinth who had committed an accidental killing and was sent to the court of a foreign king to be purified. The king's wife fell in love with him. He refused her. She told the king he had attacked her. The king sent Bellerophon to his father-in-law with a sealed letter that said, "Kill the bearer of this message." The father-in-law opened the letter and, not wanting to commit the sacrilege of killing a guest himself, sent Bellerophon on impossible tasks. Kill the chimera, a fire-breathing monster with a lion's head, a goat's body, a serpent's tail. Bellerophon caught Pegasus at the spring where the horse drank. They flew together over the chimera. Bellerophon drove a spear of lead into its throat. The fire from the creature melted the lead, and the lead poured down the throat and killed it from inside. He completed every task. He became a hero. And then he made the mistake of thinking that made him the same as a god. Story number 45, Bellerophon's Fall. Pride destroyed Bellerophon. He had ridden Pegasus above every danger. He had done the impossible, and so he turned Pegasus upward toward Olympus itself to claim his place among the gods. Zeus sent a gadfly that strung Pegasus. The horse bucked. Bellerophon fell. He did not die. The gods arranged for something to break the fall, but he was lamed, blinded, left to wander the earth alone, hungry, unable to explain why everything had been taken. Pegasus flew on to Olympus and became one of Zeus's horses. The Greeks told this story carefully, not as a warning against ambition. They loved ambitious people. As a note about direction, the sky had a ceiling, and the ceiling was real. Story number 46, Atalanta. Atalanta was exposed on a hillside at birth by a father who wanted a son. She was found and nursed by a bear, raised in the wild, and became the fastest runner in the world. She joined the Argonauts. She was the only woman present at the Caledonian boar hunt and drew first blood. She was unstoppable. Her father eventually found her and reclaimed her and wanted her to marry. She agreed on one condition: her suitor had to outrun her in a foot race. Those who lost were killed. Many tried, many died. Hippomenes prayed to Aphrodite, who gave him 3 golden apples. During the race, he threw one ahead of Atalanta. She slowed to pick it up, puzzled, drawn by the beauty of it. He threw a second, then a third. She slowed 3 times. He crossed the finish line first. Whether she was angry or relieved or grateful, the myths give her no answer. Story number 47, Oedipus. There may be no story in all of Greek mythology more precisely terrible than this one. King Laius of Thebes was told by the oracle that his son would kill him. He gave the infant to a servant with orders to leave it on a hillside to die. The servant gave the child instead to a shepherd from Corinth. The shepherd gave the child to the king and queen of Corinth, who had no son, and raised him as their own. They called him Oedipus. He grew up and heard a rumor that he was not his parents' real child. He went to Delphi to ask. The oracle would not answer the question he asked. Instead, it told him that he would kill his father and marry his mother. He fled Corinth to protect the parents he believed were his. On the road from Delphi, he met a man at a crossroads an arrogant man in a fine chariot who struck him. In the struggle that followed, Oedipus killed the man. He continued to Thebes, answered the Sphinx's riddle, freed the city, and was made king. He married the queen, a widow. He ruled for years. He was celebrated. And then the truth came, slowly, piece by piece, with all the patience of a story that already knows how it ends. Story number 48, Narcissus. Narcissus was a young man of extraordinary beauty, the son of a river god, who had been told by the oracle that he would live a long life if he never knew himself. He was loved by many. He refused all of them. Echo, a nymph who had been cursed by Hera to speak only the last words others said, followed him through the forest, able only to repeat what she heard. She loved him desperately. He turned away from her. She faded into nothing but sound. Narcissus stopped one day to drink at a pool and saw his own reflection. He had never seen himself. The oracle had said he would live long if he never knew himself, and perhaps the knowing was this, that the love he felt for the face in the water was a love that could never be returned. He stayed at the edge of that pool until he wasted away. Where he had lain in spring, a flower grew. The Greeks called it the Narcissus. It still grows near still water. Story number 49, Echo. Echo had once been a nymph of some talent. She used to stand at the edges of conversations between Zeus and his various mortal loves, keeping Hera occupied with long, entertaining stories while Zeus conducted his affairs in the forest below. Hera discovered this. She took Echo's voice, all of it, except the ability to repeat the last words she heard. Echo fell in love with Narcissus. She followed him through the forest for a long time, never able to speak first. When he called out, "Is anyone there?" she could only answer, "There." When he said, "Come here," she could only say, "Here." When he finally turned toward her, she opened her arms. He turned away. She hid in caves and forests after that. She faded. What was left of her was only sound, the sound of returning, the voice that can only answer and never begin. Story number 50, The Judgment of Paris. 3 goddesses stood before a young shepherd on the slopes of Mount Ida. They held a golden apple inscribed "For the fairest," thrown by Eris, the goddess of discord, at a wedding where she had not been invited. Zeus had refused to judge. He sent them to Paris, a prince of Troy who had been sent away from the city as an infant because of a prophecy, another prophecy, and who had grown up as a shepherd. Each goddess offered a bribe. Hera offered power, kingship over men. Athene offered wisdom and skill in battle. Aphrodite offered the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris chose Aphrodite. She gave him Helen, wife of the king of Sparta. He sailed to Sparta, was treated as a guest, and sailed home with Helen. What followed lasted 10 years and destroyed a civilization. Now we move into some of the myths that have endured most completely, the ones that shaped how the Greeks understood love and loss, and what happens when the things you reach for slip just beyond your grasp. Story number 51, Orpheus and Eurydice. Orpheus was the greatest musician who had ever lived. When he played his lyre, rivers stopped to listen. Stones moved toward the sound. Animals gathered around him in stillness. His wife Eurydice was killed. by a serpent's bite on the day of their wedding. Orpheus went to the underworld. He played for Charon, the ferryman, and Charon let him cross without requiring death. He played for Cerberus, and the three heads went still. He stood before Hades and Persephone and played a song about love and loss that made Persephone weep, the only time in all the myths she is described as weeping in the underworld. Hades agreed. Eurydice could follow Orpheus back to the living world on one condition: he must not look back. He walked, he climbed, he could hear nothing behind him, the dead move in silence. The light was near, he turned. She was there, just a step behind him. She reached toward him, and then she was gone. Some things cannot be undone, no matter how beautifully you ask. Story number 52, Psyche and Eros. Psyche was a mortal girl so beautiful that people began worshipping her instead of Aphrodite. Aphrodite was not pleased. She sent her son Eros to make Psyche fall in love with something monstrous. Eros saw her, and it was Eros himself who fell. He arranged for her to be carried to a palace at the edge of the world. He came to her only in darkness, never letting her see him, and she came to love the voice and the warmth and the presence without knowing the face. Her sisters convinced her he must be a monster. She took a lamp to look while he slept. She saw Eros, beautiful beyond anything, and in her surprise, a drop of hot oil fell from the lamp and woke him. He fled. She spent years searching for him, completing tasks set by a furious Aphrodite. She descended to the underworld and returned. At the end of everything, Zeus made her immortal. It is a story about trust and its breaking, and about what it costs to earn back what you lost through a single moment of doubt. Story number 53, Pygmalion. Pygmalion was a sculptor on the island of Cyprus who had given up on real women entirely. He had seen enough of human love and found it insufficient. He carved a statue from ivory, working for months, with a precision that became something closer to devotion. He gave her a face, he gave her hands, he gave her something in the expression that he had never managed to give to stone before. He fell in love with it. He brought the statue gifts, he draped it in fabric, he spoke to it. He prayed to Aphrodite without quite admitting what he was asking for. Aphrodite, who had a sense of humor and a fondness for the unexpected, warmed the stone. When Pygmalion touched the ivory it bent, it breathed. The woman opened her eyes. He named her Galatea. She was reportedly happy. Story number 54, Arachne. Arachne was a weaver from Lydia who was so skilled that people said she must have been taught by Athene herself. She denied it. She said her skill was her own, and she would weave against Athene herself if the goddess accepted the challenge. Athene accepted. She appeared at Arachne's door disguised as an old woman and offered advice. Arachne was not interested in advice. They wove side by side. Athene's tapestry showed the gods in their dignity, the punishment of humans who had defied them, the order of the world. Arachne's tapestry showed the gods in their worst moments, every deception, every transformation, every undignified escapade. It was, by some accounts, technically flawless. Athene destroyed it. Arachne hanged herself in shame and defiance. Athene felt something, regret, perhaps, or something she didn't have a name for, and transformed Arachne into a spider, allowing her to weave forever. Whether this was mercy, the stories did not say. Story number 55, Midas and the Golden Touch. King Midas of Phrygia was kind to an old satyr who had gotten separated from Dionysus's company. He housed and fed him and returned him to the god. Dionysus offered him a wish. Midas asked that everything he touched be turned to gold. It worked immediately. He touched an oak twig, it gilded. He touched a stone, it gleamed. He walked through his palace, running his hands along the walls, and the walls turned to gold. Then he sat down to eat. His bread was gold. His wine was gold. He reached for a piece of meat, and his fingers left a hard golden impression. He prayed to Dionysus to take the gift back. Dionysus told him to wash his hands in the river Pactolus. The gold ran off him and washed downstream. For centuries afterward, the Pactolus ran gold. Story number 56, Icarus and the Fall. Daedalus was the greatest inventor in the world, and for a time he built the labyrinth for King Minos of Crete. When Minos imprisoned him and his son Icarus on the island, Daedalus did what he always did: he made something. Wings shaped from feathers and held together with wax. He gave a pair to his son. He gave him instructions: do not fly too low, the sea spray will dampen the feathers and weigh them down. Do not fly too high, the sun will melt the wax. Fly in the middle. They launched from the cliff of Crete. Below, fishermen and farmers stopped what they were doing to watch two figures rise into the sky. Icarus felt the air under him. He felt the height. He felt something he had no name for yet, because no one had flown before him. He went higher. The wax softened. The feathers came loose. He turned once in the air, still trying to understand what was happening, and then the sky gave him back to the sea. Daedalus flew on to Sicily, carrying his grief. Story number 57, Sisyphus. Sisyphus was the craftiest man who had ever lived. He cheated death twice, once by tricking Thanatos, the personification of death, into chaining himself so that no one could die for a time, once by convincing Persephone to let him return to the upper world briefly on an errand, and then simply not going back. He was also genuinely wicked in other ways, the myths documented carefully. When he finally died properly, his punishment was elegant and permanent. He was given a boulder and a hill. His task was to push the boulder to the top. Every time he reached the summit, the boulder rolled back down. He walked back down. He pushed again. This was forever. The philosopher Albert Camus, 2,000 years later, would write that one must imagine Sisyphus happy, finding meaning in the effort itself, in each cycle of work. The Greeks were less certain. They may have just found it a fitting punishment for a man who could not stop striving. Story number 58, Tantalus. Tantalus committed an act so terrible that the myths were squeamish about even describing it clearly. He killed his own son and served him at a feast for the gods. Whatever his reason, to test them, to honor them, to see if gods could be tricked, it failed. The gods recognized what had been served. They did not eat. He was punished in the underworld with a hunger and a thirst that could never be satisfied. He stood in a pool of cool water. Above him hung branches heavy with fruit. When he reached for the fruit, the branches drew up and away. When he bent to drink, the water receded. The word tantalizing comes from him. To see what you desire always just beyond your reach, always retreating, always there but never available. This is Tantalus, and the Greeks knew somehow that it was one of the worst things they could imagine. Story number 59, Daedalus and the Labyrinth. Daedalus built many things. He built moving statues that required being chained to their bases so they would not walk away. He built the hollow wooden cow for Queen Pasiphae that led to the birth of the Minotaur. He built the labyrinth that would imprison the Minotaur, a structure so cleverly designed that even its maker was said to have barely escaped from it himself. He was Athenian by birth, brilliant beyond any craftsman, and his gift was inseparable from the trouble it brought. Every invention solved a problem and created 3 new ones. He ended his days in Sicily, in exile, in relative peace. He planted a garden there, they say, and built things that no one needed but that he made anyway, because making things was simply what he was. Story number 60, Hyacinthus. Apollo loved the Spartan prince Hyacinthus. Genuinely, unusually, the way the myths rarely described the gods loving anyone without ulterior motive. They spent days together, training, competing, lying in the grass of the Spartan fields. Apollo taught him music. Hyacinthus was quick and joyful and entirely beloved. The west wind Zephyrus also loved Hyacinthus, and one afternoon, when Apollo threw a discus and Hyacinthus ran to catch it, Zephyrus blew the disc off course. It struck Hyacinthus in the head. Apollo held him while he died, unable to heal what love had caused. From the blood where Hyacinthus fell, a flower grew. Apollo marked its petals with the letters Ai, Ai, the Greek cry of grief. The hyacinth. It blooms every spring. It is the only thing that remained. Story number 61, Adonis. Aphrodite loved a mortal. Adonis was young and beautiful and entirely devoted to the hunt. He was not careless with Aphrodite's love, but he was young and he believed he was invincible. She warned him, she begged him not to hunt boar. The boar was dangerous. The boar gored men through, and no beauty would protect him. He hunted anyway. A boar found him in a mountain forest. From his blood, where he fell, anemones grew small flowers, blood-red petals that fall almost as soon as they open. Ares sent the boar, some said, jealous of what Aphrodite had given a mortal. Others said it was simply fate, the ordinary blind fate that applies to beautiful and ordinary alike. Every year in Greece, women mourned Adonis for a day. Then they celebrated his return, for in some versions, Persephone agreed to release him for half the year. Even in death, he divided the seasons between 2 women who loved him. Story number 62, Baucis and Philemon. 2 gods walked through Phrygia disguised as travelers, tired and hungry, seeking shelter. No one would take them in. They knocked at every door in the village and were turned away. Every house had an excuse. Finally, at the edge of the village, an old couple opened their door. Baucis and Philemon were very poor. Their house was small and the thatch was low and they had almost nothing. But they brought everything they had to the table. olives and eggs and old wine and what bread there was. The wine kept refilling itself. They noticed. They tried to catch the goose they kept, to add it to the meal. The goose ran to the strangers for protection. They let the goose go. The strangers revealed themselves. The village was flooded. The two houses of every neighbor who had refused hospitality sank beneath the water. Baucis and Philemon's house became a temple. They asked for one thing, to die together so neither would have to live on alone. When their time came, they stood side by side in the temple doorway and turned to trees, a linden and an oak, growing together from the same base. Story number 63, Pyramus and Thisbe. Two young people in Babylon were kept apart by their families, who had quarreled so long no one remembered the original reason. They discovered a crack in the wall between their houses and spoke through it in whispers. The wall was not nothing, but through the crack it was almost something. They arranged to meet outside the city at night, under a white mulberry tree by a tomb. Thisbe arrived first. A lion came, its mouth bloody from a recent kill, and she ran. She dropped her veil. The lion mauled the veil and left. Pyramus arrived. He found the veil, bloody, and the lion's tracks. He concluded she was dead. He killed himself under the mulberry tree. Thisbe came back. She found him dying. She took his sword and followed. Their blood stained the mulberry's roots. The tree has borne dark fruit ever since. The Greeks said, the red-black berries of a tree that knows the cost of arriving too late. Story number 64, The Three Fates. The Moirai were three sisters. Clotho spun the thread of a life. Lachesis measured it this much, no more. Atropos cut it. Even the gods could not override them. Zeus himself was sometimes said to be subject to fate. Apollo once made them drunk with wine and begged them to spare a mortal he loved. They relented and gave the mortal extra time, but they did not give him immortality. The thread could be lengthened, it could not be made infinite. The three sisters worked quietly together in a place outside time. They did not hate anyone, they did not love anyone, they simply worked. There is a particular comfort in this, if you let it in. The ancient Greeks believed that fate was not personal, it was structural. The thread had its length, set before you were born, and no one had designed it specifically for you. It was simply the length of the thread. Story number 65, Charon and the River. The river Styx was the boundary between the living world and the world of the dead. It wound 9 times around the underworld. To cross it, the dead required 2 things, a coin to pay the ferryman and the rites of burial. Charon was ancient and largely silent, and had been doing this since before the Olympians. He stood at the stern of his boat and poled across the black water and asked for the coin that was traditionally placed on the tongue or on the eyes of the dead. Those who could not pay, those whose bodies had not been buried, who had been left unburied on the field of battle or the shore of the sea, waited. 100 years on the far bank, unable to cross, unable to go back. This is why burial mattered so much to the Greeks. The coin was a small mercy. The rites were the door. To leave someone unburied was to trap them at the edge of 2 worlds. We approach now the Great War at the center of Greek mythology, the Siege of Troy. It lasted 10 years and brought down a civilization, and its stories of heroes and gods and human stubbornness and love are among the oldest and most fully imagined stories in the world. Story number 66, Helen. Helen of Sparta was said to be the most beautiful person in the world. Her father, Zeus, had come to her mother disguised as a swan, and perhaps that accounted for something, though what exactly was never explained. When she came of age, every king and prince in Greece sent suitors. Her stepfather made them all swear an oath. Whoever married Helen, all the others would come to his defense if she was ever taken from him. She married Menelaus, king of Sparta. They were, by most accounts, reasonably happy. Then Paris of Troy came as a guest. Aphrodite had promised Paris the most beautiful woman in the world, and she delivered her promise. What Aphrodite did not say, what promises of this kind rarely say, was what the cost would be for everyone else. Story number 67, Achilles. Achilles was the son of Peleus, a mortal king, and Thetis, a sea nymph who had been prophesied to bear a son greater than his father. The gods had feared this and arranged her marriage to a mortal, so the prophecy would not threaten Olympus. Thetis loved her son with the intensity of someone who knew what was coming. She carried him to the river Styx and held him by the heel and dipped him into the waters of invulnerability. Every part of him that the dark water touched became impervious to harm. The heel stayed dry. He grew up extraordinary, faster, stronger, more beautiful than ordinary men, trained by the centaur Chiron in the mountains to be what he was always going to be. He knew he was going to die at Troy. He had been told. He chose to go anyway because the Greeks could not win without him and because he wanted to be remembered. He got what he wanted. Story number 68, The Rage of Achilles. The Iliad begins with a word, rage. Achilles had been dishonored by Agamemnon, the commander of the Greek forces, who had taken his prize from him. Achilles withdrew from battle. He sat in his tent and let the Greeks die. He refused all attempts to bring him back. He sat by the sea and spoke to his mother, who came up from the water to listen. He was proud and furious and entirely unwilling to be reasonable about it. The Greeks began to lose. The Trojans pushed them back to the ships. Achilles watched. His best friend Patroclus could not bear it. He put on Achilles' armor and led the Myrmidons into battle, hoping the sight of that armor would frighten the Trojans. It did for a time. Then Hector of Troy killed him. Story number 69, Hector. Hector was everything a hero was supposed to be, and he was on the wrong side. He was the greatest warrior of Troy, prince, husband, father, the city's last defense. He killed Patroclus thinking he was Achilles. He knew what that death would mean. He went home that evening. He said goodbye to his wife Andromache, who held their son on her hip. The child was frightened by the horsehair plume on his father's helmet. Hector took it off and laughed and held his son. He put the helmet back on. He went back to the field. Achilles returned to battle. He hunted Hector across the plains of Troy. They ran 3 times around the walls of the city before Hector stopped and turned. He asked only that his body be returned for burial. Achilles refused. He dragged the body behind his chariot. He could not leave it there forever. Something moved in him eventually. He returned the body to Hector's father, an old king named Priam, who walked into the enemy camp at night and wept at the feet of the man who had killed his son and asked for what was his. Achilles wept with him. Sometimes the Greeks understood something that required two men who had every reason to destroy each other, finding, briefly, a common grief. Story number 70, the Trojan horse. 10 years had passed. The walls of Troy had never been breached. Odysseus proposed the idea: a great wooden horse, hollow, large enough to hold men inside. It would be left at the gate of Troy as an offering to Athene. The Greek fleet would sail away visibly past the horizon. The Trojans would find the horse on the plain in the morning. Cassandra told them it was a trick. She was always right, and no one ever believed her. A priest named Laocoon said the same and was killed by a sea serpent, and the Trojans read this as a sign that the gods were angry at the doubt. They brought the horse inside the gates. That night the fleet came back. The men inside the horse opened the belly and climbed out into the dark city. They opened the gates. Troy fell in fire, the flames visible for miles, carried up into the smoke of a thing that had stood for 1,000 years. Story number 71, Odysseus and the Cyclops. After the fall of Troy, Odysseus set sail for home. He would not arrive for 10 years. Early in his journey, he came to the island of the Cyclopes, giant one-eyed shepherds who answered to no gods and no laws. He and his men went into the cave of Polyphemus, son of Poseidon, and Polyphemus sealed them in with a great stone. Each morning the Cyclops ate 2 men, each evening 2 more. Odysseus made a plan. He found a wooden stake and sharpened it. He gave Polyphemus wine until the giant fell asleep. Then he drove the stake into the great eye. Polyphemus rolled the stone back to let his sheep out in the morning. Odysseus and his remaining men hid under the bellies of the sheep and passed out with them. Before they sailed away, Odysseus called back his name, Odysseus of Ithaca, son of Laertes. He could not resist it. Polyphemus prayed to his father Poseidon. Poseidon heard, and Odysseus's journey home was long and dark and full of things that no map had warned him about. Story number 72, the Sirens. The sirens were creatures who sang. Their voices were the most beautiful thing a man could hear, and their song contained exactly what each listener most needed to hear. The song custom-made somehow for each ear that caught it. The shore beneath their cliff was white with the bones of men who had turned their ships toward the singing. Odysseus wanted to hear them without dying. He had his men fill their ears with wax and tie him to the mast. They rowed past. The sirens sang. He heard it, all of it, and screamed to be untied and strained at the ropes. His men rowed on, unable to hear him or the song. He heard something that no other man lived to hear, and he could never describe what the song had promised, only that it had seemed, in the moment, like everything he had ever wanted. Story number 73, Penelope Waiting. While Odysseus was gone, suitors filled his palace. They assumed he was dead. They wanted his wife and his kingdom. They ate his food and drank his wine and competed for Penelope's attention, and Penelope was brilliant and patient and not at all ready to give up. She told them she would choose when she finished weaving a funeral shroud for her father-in-law. She wove by day. At night, alone, she unraveled what she had done. 3 years she did this. 3 years of weaving and unraveling, maintaining the illusion of progress while buying time she didn't know she needed. Odysseus came home in disguise. He was recognized only by his old dog, who wagged his tail once and died. He came home and found his house full of men who wanted what was his, and then, quietly and precisely, he took it back. The reunion with Penelope was cautious and careful and exactly right. She had survived 20 years of waiting by not trusting anything easily. She made him prove himself. He did. Story number 74, Eos and the Dawn. Eos was the goddess of the dawn, the sister of Helios, the sun god, and she woke every morning before her brother to drive her chariot and open the gates of the sky. She had a history of falling in love with mortal men. Aurora, the Romans would call her, and her loves were her famous characteristic. She fell in love with Tithonus, a Trojan prince, and asked Zeus to grant him immortality. Zeus granted it. She had forgotten to ask for eternal youth. Tithonus aged. He continued to age past what anyone had imagined, growing smaller and stranger until Eos could no longer bear to look at what he had become. She turned him into a cicada and kept him in a golden cage. Every morning she opens the sky. Every morning the cicada's song rises from the grass. Story number 75, Morpheus and the Realm of Dreams. Near the cave of Hypnos, the god of sleep, ran the river Lethe, the river of forgetting. The dead drank from it and forgot their lives. Even the living, sleeping, sometimes drank a little from its waters. Morpheus was the son of Hypnos and the god of dreams. He could take any human form, husband, wife, friend, enemy. He visited the sleeping and delivered messages from the gods, or simply filled the sleeping mind with what it needed or feared. His siblings were the other dreams, Phobta, who brought animal dreams and animal terror, Phantasos, who brought dreams of the inanimate world, of stone and water. Together they rose each night from the cave near the edge of the world and scattered through the dark air above sleeping cities. Every dream any person had, any night in ancient Greece, was one of them landing softly and pressing its face briefly against the sleeper's mind. Story number 76, Phaeton. Phaeton was the son of Helios, the sun god, and he grew up hearing his friends deny his parentage. He went to his father to ask for proof. Helios loved him. He promised him anything. Phaeton asked to drive the chariot of the sun for one day. Helios begged him to ask for something else, anything else. He described the horses, unruly, too large, pulling always toward the highest sky. He described the path narrow above the earth, bounded by monsters. He described what could go wrong. Phaeton insisted. A promise was a promise. He took the reins. The horses felt at once that the hands on them were lighter, less certain. They left the path. The chariot swung low, scorching the earth. The deserts of North Africa were burned, they said. Rivers dried, cities burned. Zeus struck the chariot with a thunderbolt. Phaeton fell into the river Eridanus. His sisters wept on the banks until the gods transformed them into poplar trees. Their tears fell as amber from the branches, amber, that strange ancient substance, sometimes still found with something preserved inside. Story number 77, The Three Graces. The three Graces, Aglaea, Euphrosyne, and Thalia, were the embodiments of charm and beauty and human flourishing. They attended Aphrodite. They danced. They were the feeling of ease, of warmth, of a gathering where people were genuinely glad to be together. Their names meant brilliance, joy, and bloom. The Greeks believed that the good things in life needed to be cultivated, tended, given room. The Graces were the principle behind that belief. You could build a house, you could plant grain, but you also needed this other thing, this quality of life that was not simply survival, not simply function, but something that justified the whole enterprise. They danced in a ring and held hands and moved in a slow circle that had no beginning and no end, each one giving and receiving equally. Story number 78, Arion and the Dolphin. Arion was the greatest musician in Corinth, a real person the Greeks remembered with something like reverence. He won enormous prizes at a festival in Sicily and set sail for home with his winnings. The sailors decided to take the money and throw him overboard. He asked for one last gift, to sing one final song before they killed him. They agreed. He sang. He played with everything he had. The dolphins heard. He dove into the sea himself before they could push him. The dolphins had gathered, drawn by the music, by whatever it is that dolphins hear in human song. One carried him on its back to the Greek shore. He arrived home before the ship. When the sailors landed and told Periander the king that Arion had died at sea, Arion walked in. The god Apollo placed a dolphin and a lyre among the stars. That constellation is still up there. Story number 79, the Nymphs. The Greek world was full. Every mountain had an Oread, a nymph of rocky places who knew the paths and passes as well as she knew her own hands. Every river had a Naiad, a freshwater spirit who lived in the current and could be glimpsed on summer mornings as a shimmer above the water. Every tree had a Dryad, and when the tree was cut, the Dryad died with it, which is why cutting a sacred grove was considered among the worst things a person could do. The nymphs were not exactly divine and not exactly mortal. They aged very slowly and lived very long. They were the presences of the natural world made visible, not metaphors, but entities, particular, individual, known to shepherds and hunters who had spent enough time in the wild places. The world was not empty. Every spring, every grotto, every old tree was someone's home. Story number 80, Selene and the Sleeping Shepherd. Selene was the goddess of the moon. She drove her silver chariot across the night sky, pulling the full moon behind her. She saw one night on Mount Latmus a shepherd sleeping in the open air. His name was Endymion. He was young and beautiful and entirely still in his sleep. Selene stopped. She descended. She looked at him for a long time. She asked Zeus to grant him eternal sleep, not death, but a sleep without aging, a sleep forever. She visited him in his cave on the mountain in the silver light, and he slept on, and she loved him in the way you can love something beautiful that never changes. Some versions say she had 50 daughters by him, born in the years of her watching. He is still there, the Greeks said, sleeping on Mount Latmus, unchanged, forever young, with the light of the moon on his face every night. Story number 81, the River Gods. Every river in Greece was divine. The Aeolus was the oldest and greatest of the river gods, a shape-shifter who could become a bull or a serpent or a man with a bull's head and a beard of green water weeds. He wrestled Heracles once for the right to marry a woman and lost one of his horns. From that horn, filled with fruit and grain, came the cornucopia, the horn of plenty, the symbol of abundance overflowing. The river gods were grandfathers of the world. They had been there before the Olympians. They were water and time, and the Greek cities built along their banks knew this. Every offering to the river was an acknowledgement that the water had been there before the city and would run on after. Story number 82, Elysium. The blessed dead, the heroes, the righteous, those whom the gods had particularly loved, went to Elysium. It was an island, some said, in the far west, or a plain within the underworld lit by its own light. Either way, it was warm, the grass was green, the air was mild, there was music sometimes and feasting, and the figures of the dead moved through it without suffering. The most blessed were sometimes reborn 3 times, and if each life was lived with virtue, they went to the Isles of the Blessed, a place so serene that the myths barely tried to describe it. The Greeks were not certain about any of this. Different sources described it differently, but they needed to believe in something beyond the grey asphodel fields, beyond the indifferent sorting of ordinary souls. They needed somewhere for the things that had been beautiful to go. Story number 83, Daphne and the Laurel. Apollo was struck by one of Eros's golden arrows, designed to inspire love, and in the same moment, Daphne was struck by one of the lead arrows, designed to repel it. Apollo loved, Daphne ran. She ran through forests and across rivers with Apollo behind her, and she was fast, but he was a god. Near the bank of a river, when she could run no further, she called out to her father, who was the river god Peneus, to help her. She slowed, her skin hardened, bark closed over her hands, her hair lifted into branches. The laurel tree stands where she had been standing, and the river runs past it. Apollo stood with his arms around the trunk. He said, "You would not be my love, so you will be my tree." He wove a laurel crown for his hair. He gave the laurel to athletes and poets and victors, the highest honor he could offer. He visited her every year. Story number 84, Pan. Pan was strange, even by the standards of the Greek gods. He was the god of the wild, of shepherds and flocks, of mountain spaces, and the panic that came over men in remote places without reason, panic, the unreasoning terror that bore his name. He had the legs and horns of a goat and the body of a man, and he played the pipes. The pipes he had made himself. He had loved a nymph named Syrinx, who ran from him to the river and called to the water nymphs for help. They transformed her into hollow reeds. The wind played through them as Pan stood there. He cut them and bound them and played the sound of her. Every musician who plays the panpipes since has been playing, without knowing it, the sound of Pan standing at a river's edge, holding what he had lost. Story number 85, Apollo and the Sun. Every morning Helios drove his chariot of fire across the sky, and later, in some traditions, this task was transferred to Apollo, god of the sun. Either way, the mechanism was the same. The horses were enormous and unruly, and pulled always toward the zenith. The path was marked by the constellations that the chariot must navigate, the scorpion, which the horses feared, and which caused them to swerve low and scorch the earth of Africa. At evening, the chariot descended into the ocean in the west. A golden cup waited there, made by Hephaestus, and the sun god rode in it through the dark current beneath the world, around to the east, to begin again. Every morning, the horses saddled in the dark east, the light building at the horizon, the cup ready in the western sea, a machinery vast and ancient, running by its own necessity, noticed by millions who never once thought about the god inside it. From the great stories of war and gods, we move now into the softer places, the quieter myths, the ones that survive because of something beautiful in them, something that asked to be remembered even when it wasn't the loudest story in the room. Story number 86, The Apple of Discord. Eris, the goddess of discord, was not invited to the wedding of Peleus and Thetis. The gods had decided to exclude her because her presence always caused trouble. She came anyway. She dropped the golden apple on the table among the celebrating gods. It said, for the fairest. Hera, Athene, and Aphrodite all reached for it simultaneously. This was the moment the Greeks identified as the beginning of the Trojan War, before the ships were built, before Paris was born, before Helen was old enough to be promised to anyone. At a wedding, the beginning of a new family, a celebration of love, the thing that would destroy Troy was dropped onto a table. Discord does not announce itself. It arrives at celebrations. It asks innocent questions. It waits. Story number 87, Io. Zeus loved Io, who was a priestess of Hera. Hera noticed. Zeus transformed Io into a white heifer to hide her. Hera, entirely unsuspecting, asked Zeus for the cow as a gift. He could not refuse without admitting everything. Hera gave the cow to Argus, the 100-eyed giant, to guard. Argus had eyes all over his body and could watch in every direction at once, some of them sleeping while others stayed awake. Zeus sent Hermes, who approached Argus playing pipes and telling stories in the voice that could not be resisted. One by one, all 100 eyes fell closed. Hermes killed him. Hera put Argus's eyes in the tail of the peacock. She sent a gadfly to sting Io forever, driving the heifer across the world in agony. Io ran through Asia, through Egypt, across the sea that took her name, the Ionian Sea. Eventually, Zeus restored her and she had a son. The wandering ended. Everything ended eventually. Story number 88, Ganymede. Ganymede was a young Trojan prince, the most beautiful mortal alive, and Zeus wanted him. He sent his eagle, or transformed himself into an eagle, and carried Ganymede up to Olympus. He made him the cupbearer of the gods, immortal, forever young, pouring nectar at the divine feast. His father mourned. Zeus sent horses of divine breeding as compensation. Whether the father found this adequate, the myths did not record. Ganymede is among the stars, the constellation Aquarius, the water-bearer, still pouring, still young. The Greeks held this myth comfortably alongside their others. A god had desired something mortal and taken it. The mortal had been elevated, had received what most mortals could not dream of. What had been taken was also, in a different telling, given. The myths did not always resolve their contradictions. Sometimes they just held them. Story number 89, Cassandra. She had been given the gift of prophecy by Apollo, and then the curse of disbelief by the same god when she refused him. She watched the wooden horse being dragged into the city of Troy and said, "Do not bring it inside." She watched Paris sail for Greece and said, "This voyage will destroy us." She watched the Greeks arrive on the plain and said, "They will win." She was always right. She was never believed. The people of Troy heard her as madness. Her family locked her away. The soldiers who had fought for 10 years ignored her. She survived the war and was taken as a slave to Mycenae. She walked into the palace there and looked at the woman waiting inside and said, "We will not leave this place alive." She was not wrong. The gift and the curse were the same thing. To see clearly and to speak clearly and to be understood by no one is one of the particular griefs that Greek mythology imagined with unusual precision. Story number 90, The Labors of Psyche. Aphrodite set Psyche 4 tasks. Sort all of this grain by morning, and the pile of mixed grain was enormous. Ants came in the night and sorted it, because the earth and its creatures pitied her. Fetch golden wool from the violent rams on the other side of the river. A reed in the river told her to wait until they slept and gather what had caught on the brambles. Fetch water from the Styx, where it falls from the highest cliff and is too fast and too terrible for mortal hands. An eagle took the jar from her and filled it. Go to the underworld and bring back a box of beauty from Persephone. She came back up. She had the box, and she opened it because Psyche's essential quality was curiosity, the thing that had made her look at Eros in the first place, and inside was not beauty but sleep. As she fell, Eros found her. He took the sleep from her eyes and put it back in the box. He flew to Zeus and asked for her to be made immortal. Zeus agreed. Even Aphrodite eventually accepted what her son loved. The task completed, the god and the mortal united. The girl who opened every box was rewarded, in the end, for her willingness to open them. Story number 91, Atalanta's Race. We told Atalanta's story once, but there is something in it worth returning to in the dark. She ran, for years, she ran faster than anyone. She had been raised by a bear and had no reason to believe that the world required her to slow down. She was given a destiny that said marriage, that said stay, and she turned it into a race. She lost the race not because she was slower. She lost because she saw something worth stopping for. 3 times, 3 golden apples thrown on the path ahead, impossible, beautiful, worth a step to the side. Some have said this is a parable about women distracted from their strength. Some have said it is about the inevitability of love. Some have said Atalanta was curious, and curiosity was her nature, and following it was never a weakness. She ran for a long time. She was extraordinary. The world still needed her to slow down once, just once, and she did. Story number 92, Hades and Persephone again. They were married, eventually, in whatever way the king of the underworld and his queen were married, in silence, in the dark, with no guests but the dead. She was queen of the underworld for half the year. The Greeks described her as powerful there, as implacable as her husband, as someone you prayed to if you wanted something from the dead. She had become something real in her time below. When Orpheus came and played, and she wept, it was perhaps the weeping of someone who understood perfectly what it cost to love something and lose it to the necessity of the world. She sent Persephone back each spring, not only because Zeus had negotiated it, but because she understood something about grief, that seasons cannot be abolished, that things return, that the same cold dark that claims things also holds them, keeps them, and gives them back when the time is right. Story number 93, Philoctetes. He carried the bow of Heracles. He had lit the hero's funeral pyre when no one else would, and Heracles had given him the bow as thanks. It was the finest weapon in the world. He was bitten by a serpent on the way to Troy, and the wound would not heal. It suppurated, and the smell was unbearable. The Greeks abandoned him on the island of Lemnos. He lived there for 10 years, alone, hunting with the bow, surviving. The Greeks eventually learned, through the oracle, that Troy could not fall without the bow of Heracles. They came back for him. He refused. They had to find another way, through argument, through remorse, through the intervention of the dead Heracles himself, who appeared and told him to go. He went, he killed Paris, Troy fell. He went home afterward to a Greece that had been away 10 years, that had changed in all the ways things change. The myths do not say what he found there. They leave him walking off the ship into whatever was waiting. Story number 94, The Apple and the Goddess. There is a story older than the Olympians, barely visible in the cracks of the better-known myths. Before Zeus, before the sky gods, there was a goddess called Gaia, and she had an orchard in the west where golden apples grew. She gave these apples as a wedding gift to Hera. They were tended by nymphs called the Hesperides and guarded by a dragon that never slept. These were the apples Heracles fetched on his 11th labor. These were the apples Hippomenes used to slow Atalanta. This was the apple that Eris threw on the table at the wedding that started the Trojan War. One orchard, one tree, the same fruit passed through 10 centuries of story, causing and resolving and causing again. The apple is always there at the center of the oldest stories, still on the branch, still golden. Story number 95, The Island of Circe. Odysseus and his men landed on the island of Aea, where Circe lived, a daughter of the sun, a sorceress, a woman who turned things into what they fundamentally were. She turned his men into pigs. Hermes met Odysseus on the way to her house and gave him an herb, moly, white-flowered, black-rooted, that would protect him from her magic. He went in. The spell did not work. He drew his sword. Circe was surprised. She became cordial. She turned his men back into men and kept Odysseus there for a year and taught him things he needed to know for what was coming. She told him how to get home. She told him to visit the underworld first, to speak to the dead prophet Tiresias, who alone among the dead retained his wits. She described the route. She warned him about the sirens, about Scylla, about the cattle of the sun that he must not touch. He touched the cattle anyway. The men he was with touched them. The ship was destroyed. He alone survived. Circe had told him. She had said it clearly. Some things you tell people knowing that the telling will not be enough. Story number 96, The Fate of Ajax. Ajax the Greater was the strongest warrior in the Greek army after Achilles, enormous, imperturbable, a wall that could not be moved. After Achilles died, his armor was to be given to the greatest remaining Greek warrior. The vote was between Ajax and Odysseus. They chose Odysseus. Ajax could not bear it. He decided in the night to kill Agamemnon and Odysseus and Menelaus. Athene sent madness over him, and he slaughtered cattle and sheep instead, believing them to be his enemies. When the madness cleared, he saw what he had done. He saw himself standing in a field of slaughtered animals with blood on his sword, and he understood. He killed himself. The armor went to Odysseus. He carried it the rest of the way home. He never wore it. The Greeks told this story, perhaps, because they understood that grief and humiliation are genuinely dangerous, that the strongest man can be destroyed by what is not given to him, that the wound of being overlooked can go deep enough to break something that seemed unbreakable. Story number 97, The Last Echo. In a valley in Boeotia, long after the heroes were gone, a shepherd sat at midday and heard something. He wasn't sure at first. The rock formations played tricks, but when he called out, "Hello, is anyone there?" the word came back, "There," and when he said, "I'm listening," the valley gave back, "Listening." He sat for a while, calling out things, and hearing the last of each thing returned. There was something in it that he couldn't describe later, something that felt like not being alone, and also like a reminder of something lost. He didn't know the story of Echo. He didn't know that she had once been whole and speaking, and that what remained of her was this: the capacity to return what others said, to end every exchange by giving back the last word. He walked home in the evening and didn't tell anyone what he'd heard, because there was no way to say it that didn't sound strange. But he came back the next day. Story number 98, Hypnos and the End of the Day. The cave of Hypnos was at the edge of the world, where the sun does not reach even at noon, where a perpetual twilight held the air close and still. Poppies grew at the entrance. The river Lethe murmured nearby. Inside, in beds of black feathers and soft wood, the god of sleep reclined. He was not threatening. He was gentle, one of the gentlest forces in all the myths. His brother was Thanatos, death, and the two were twins, born together in the dark, and it was said they were nearly identical. The difference was that Hypnos touched you softly and let you go. Every night he rose and scattered sleep over the earth like seeds. He carried a poppy stem. He touched the temples of the weary. He did not discriminate. King and shepherd, hero and coward, the grieving and the content, all of them received him equally. All of them eventually let go. Story number 99, The Fields of Asphodel. Most of the dead were not heroes. They had lived ordinary lives, tending fields, raising children, keeping fires burning, growing old. They were not wicked enough for punishment and not distinguished enough for reward. They went to the fields of asphodel, where pale flowers grew in the gray light. They moved through those fields like shadows of themselves, vague and wandering, no longer remembering clearly what had mattered when they were alive. The drink from the river of forgetting had taken most of it. It was not terrible, it was simply neutral, a long, mild, undifferentiated continuation. The Greeks had many versions of what came after, and not all of them agreed. But this was the most honest one, that most people simply continued, dimly, in a place that had no strong weather, no strong feeling, no particular direction. And perhaps that was accurate, and perhaps, after the strong weather of a life, it was enough. Story number 100, The Old World at Evening. Somewhere, the myths were still being told. Not in books yet, the books came later. In the dark, around fires, while children fell asleep and woke and fell asleep again, while shepherds passed the long hours, while sailors watched the constellations they had named and felt the sea move under them. The gods of Olympus were present in those evenings, not as supernatural force, not as theology, but as stories, as ways of understanding why the seasons turned and why love was painful, and why the strongest things sometimes broke, and why sometimes things worked out at the last moment in ways that seemed too unlikely for accident. The world was full. Every spring was a god's house. Every dolphin remembered a musician. Every echo was a voice that had once been whole. The fire burned lower. The storyteller's voice slowed. The children who had been awake were now asleep, faces slack, breathing the deep, slow breath of the deeply unconscious. The fire burned lower still. These stories are 3,000 years old, and they are not old at all. Every person who ever fell asleep to someone else's voice, every child who drifted off to the sound of a story without catching how it ended, they are part of this same chain. The Greeks told these stories to each other in the dark, around fires on hillsides and in harbors, before the great libraries were built, before any of it was written down. You have been listening to something ancient tonight, something that has been carried in human memory for 100 generations. Let it settle wherever it wants to settle. Let the gods of Olympus take their places quietly, Zeus in the clouds, Poseidon in the deep water, Hades in the still kingdom below everything. Let the heroes rest, finally, in the Elysian fields that they were promised. Let Persephone walk through spring, and Demeter watch the grain grow, and the three fates work their quiet threads. Let the echo in the valley return, whatever you send it. Let the river run. You are part of this now. Every person who heard these stories and carried them forward for one more generation. Every mind that held them through the dark and gave them to the next person who needed them. Sleep well. The stories will be here when you wake.